So before I introduce our keynote luncheon speaker, I do want to go over just a couple things I didn't get to mention before we started this morning. First of all, full speaker bios are available on the event website at eli.org/events. You can find today's event. That's why we're not doing full elaborate speaker bios, because you can find all that information yourself. I do want to mention again that for those of you participating through the webinar, you can submit questions through GoTo's question box. For those of you here, if you get a chance, next time you step out of the room, if you haven't signed in yet, we have a sign-in sheet at the reception desk, just so we know who all is here. Also at the desk, there's now some copies of the agenda, so you know what you're doing for the rest of the day. Looks like most of you found lunch, so that's great. And Ira, is there... Good. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our luncheon keynote speaker. Dr. Markus Zils is joining us from Munich, Germany, and we really appreciate him doing that. Dr. Zils is the founder and managing director of Returnity Partners, GmbH, which I guess is some sort of German corporate entity that I don't know how to pronounce. Dr. Zils was formerly the circular economy practice lead for McKinsey & Company, who did the work for MacArthur Foundation, which you've heard a lot about already today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Zils. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be with you via internet media today. I wish you all bon appetit. I will talk today about 4 questions. Sort of what is the underlying change in the macroeconomic environment that has given the circular economy so many impetus over the last couple of years. Secondly, sort of what are strategic options for corporates to respond to these changes in the economic context, and then really dive into the circular economy and look a little bit at the inner business case of it. And I promise you to also show the butterfly chart. And at the end, I will conclude with asking the question, sort of, what does it take to really get started? I think although in the previous panel, there was quite a bit of discussion around sort of how to really make it work. So in order to get started, we are really facing a resource revolution currently. And this is very much driven by the fact that we are living in a time of unprecedented growth. So if you look at the United Kingdom during the first industrial revolution, it took them over 150 years to double GDP on a population at that time of 9 million. Today you see this doing China and India at a population of together 2 billion, sort of in less than 15 years. So this is driving a tremendous amount of wealth creation, and it drives a tremendous amount of growth, which boils down to the already many times quoted 3 billion more middle-class consumers. And this puts a lot of poverty out of the world, but it creates an unprecedented consumption base. And that is very much sort of the demand shock that we need to deal with. That, if you now look at the supply side, is mirrored by a fact where many of the elements that we need for our economic business day-to-day procedures have a very limited availability forecast. Therefore, it's a question around sort of how do you actually secure future stock. It's not only a question around price, it's very much a question around being able to produce at all. So for companies these days, they go a lot through their bill of materials and try to understand their exposure, not from a material price and volatility point of view, but really from a question around availability. And that scarcity is compounded by the fact that whilst we have invested a lot already in recycling, the recycling volumes and the recovery rate that we achieve for many of these critical materials is not sufficient to actually bring that back into circulation. So on the one side, we have a tremendous consumer awakening, demand shock of unprecedented know-how, unprecedented time. At the same time, we have faced quite a bit of scarcity for a lot of critical materials. And as a result of that, the famously sort of quoted eradication of a century worth of price decline in about 2000, way before the economic crisis of 2008, has triggered a substantial increase in material and resource prices. And that increase is not only in itself noticeable by corporates, the volatility that comes with it is even of greater importance. So in about 2012, when a large European car manufacturer looked at their deviations from profits, they identified 500 million of unplanned material price increase. Even for a large automotive corporate, $500 million represents quite a substantial share of the profit. So you can plan your labor, you can plan your capital expenditure, but what really gets to you is material price volatility, because a lot of these prices are purchased on the stock market or option market, spot market. It is very, very hard to hedge against that. That's why a lot of corporate leaders not only look for the scarcity, they also worry about the material price incline in total, but they're very much sort of worried about volatility, because that affects immediately all other type of corporate decision-making, investment plans, etc. And that is why sort of since the 2000, we have seen this very remarkable deviation from previous price trends and volatility trends. This has gained so much attention and attraction within the business community. And why you think this might be only the case for a lot of the well-traded commodities, this also affects some quite ubiquitous materials. Sort of if you look at sand, given that we're having such a construction and urbanization boom in Africa, at some parts the sand has become a scarce commodity. So while this is abstract terms and the work that we do, we see a lot of very specific questions, people going through their feedstock and wondering sort of how can they secure it at reasonable price. So what we're seeing is an unprecedented demand shock paired with sort of little visibility on future stocks, and that gives rise to high volatility in increasing prices, and that forms the context of the circular economy. So now what are the strategic choices for a company to respond to that? There's basically three options. The first one is you try to get more supply, and there are substantial investments in the mining community, but at that point also the cost of new exploration is tremendously increasing over the last decades. So the quality of reserves and the grade of reserves is decaying constantly. So for a lot of material classes, supply constraints are quite substantial. Obviously, you can do improve efficiency, and there's a lot of strives in that, and that has been sort of one of the core reasons for economies to actually produce value in the past, is that we actually achieve every year about 2 or 3 percentage points efficiency gains, and that is very important basis to also start to decouple growth from input of material and energy. But this has been the traditional view, and what has been proposed now is to actually look at a systems change, a paradigm shift on how you can address that substantial gap between demand and supply for critical materials. And the circular economy promised to deliver this non-linear productivity gain, and this is an example where we have brought 3 different products. You see that basically you achieve 2 to 3 percentage point efficiency gains, but it is completely absorbed by the overall market growth. So the total amount in absolute terms of materials required is still going. And if you do then this very simple mental exercise and say you use a carpet twice, a fridge 3 times, and a furniture 4 times, then you see that you get to very non-linear exponential type of material savings and material productivity gains. And that simple observation is why a lot of corporates like to pursue a better quest on, is it really possible to decouple economic growth, manufacturing, from the use of finite resources. And that was the point when Al MacArthur asked the question, 3 exam questions. So if we really would go circular, does it really solve the resource question, or do we just buy time? Is it profitable for businesses? Because if it's not, then we might have an issue to actually force it into legislation and force it into corporate decision making. And is it good for the economy as a whole? And in order to have a mental mind map, a mental map framework for calculating these effects, the butterfly diagram was being devised and used. So in the middle you see linear supply chain as we know it today. You take materials out of the ground, you harvest it from the biosphere, you create parts out of it, you produce products, you put this into service package or sell it to customers. And at the end of the day, this goes into energy recovery on landfill. And today, about 80+% of the materials that we produce going that linear route still. And if you take it only for plastics in itself, we waste about 400 billion worth of plastics every year. So if you would take that as in financial terms, we basically would have a Black Friday every week, just writing off so much material value. The idea is very simple to bring it back. As mentioned already previously, if you have technical materials, we try to keep them in the loop as long as possible. And by bringing it to the recycling loop, you harvest back the material. And that typically comes along with quite substantial energy savings, but it's still sort of at the lowest form of aggregation for which you can then form a product. If you do maintenance and you prolong the useful period of a product, you save all of the embedded energy, capital costs, labor, etc. that has been used in previous steps. That's why the notion of staying in the inner loop preserves more embedded cost, capital cost, etc. On the left-hand side, the biodegradable and bionutrients, the idea is that you start cascading, and there are a lot of examples where you can extract quite relevant feedstocks from disposed waste. For instance, there are cosmetics firms that go for orange peel for getting some specific products out that they can use for cosmetic products. So these are the mental framework of describing how a circular economy can work, but it's also an excellent tool for calculating trade-offs between a linear and reverse cycle activity, because obviously you need to put in labor, energy, capital cost also on the reverse side.
Excuse me, Dr. Zils, we are not seeing your slides change. I know we were dealing with this earlier and we thought we had it this morning, but we're still looking at the first slide of your presentation.
Oh, thank you for stopping me.
Sorry to interrupt.
You don't see it at all, yeah?
We see it in the PowerPoint program, like you could still edit it. So if you're changing slides somewhere on your screen, that's not what you're sharing with us.
That's a pity. How can I fix that?
Dr. Zils, are you using two screens for your PowerPoint or two monitors? Are you using two monitors? Okay. Yeah, and if you can hit up page and down page and put it into a slideshow mode, that might. Yeah, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the program, you see some different boxes inside other. There we go. All right. There's the butterfly. Yeah, now we see the butterfly. Thank you so much.
So do you want me to carry on from here, or shall I go back and...
Oh, we can go from here. I think we were able to follow most of it. We weren't even sure if you were changing them, but now we knew when you said on the left-hand side.
Thank you. Now, so I think that diagram, the butterfly that you see in front of you, is not only sort of a visualization of the principle, it is an excellent tool for calculating the different arbitrage opportunities. And sort of how do you drive value in this? And there are basically four very simple principles. So obviously, if you try to stay on the inner loops of that diagram, the chances of harvesting embedded cost savings, etc., is much higher. If you circle longer, you produce the same type of economic utility, but without having to replace material input. If you take cascades, then you offset input into different value chains. For instance, my jacket here very likely has a chance of being recycled and become upholstery for a chair, thereafter potentially insulation for some warm water pipes. So that's requires sort of cross-industrial collaboration where products cascade down because you cannot bring it back to the original quality. And then on the right-hand side, on the bottom, there is this question around pure flows. And that is one which is not easily understood. And I sort of heard this morning that you are quite interested in sort of the beer anecdotes. We have also one on the pure flow. Sort of when Germany sort of introduced its PET bottle recycling, they used to be all transparent. So you had a homogeneous feedstock. But as the Germans like drinking beer not out of transparent bottles, but of brown bottles, they also introduced brown PET bottles. But the processing units were not prepared for that. So it was a very costly process of sorting them out. Now it's sort of all automated and not a problem. But by actually putting little contaminated products into large feedstocks, they can make it virtually impossible for recycling and recuperation, or dramatically increase the cost. So each of these elements, if applied together, allow you to calculate the benefit that you can accrue. So the first exam question that was asked, would it really decouple economic growth from intake of finite resources? On the first chart on the top, you see a product that actually grows 3 percentage points per year. And if you would not produce in a circular way, you would also require that type of material. If you start to reuse the product, refurbish it and take parts out of it, and at the end recycle it to only 50% in each of the steps, you actually would dramatically offset the required material. And that is to a less growth trajectory on the material than the growth trajectory on the utility. So it's really aiding to decouple. If you then think about products taken from the biosphere that are used longer than it takes for them to regenerate, for instance, bamboo, then you actually could see positive decoupling taking place. And that is why there's a fundamental belief, if you would do that at scale, that the circular economy would be able to decouple economic growth from the usage of finite resource, which comes back to the argument that was also mentioned this morning around abundance. Now the question is that something that is attractive for corporates? And we've done this for a number of products, and we have taken here the example of a mobile phone. Sort of in 85% of the times, after only 18 months, the mobile phone is exchanged, and only a very small portion of it is being recycled today. If you would do this in a circular economy fashion and you would collect more, you could actually redistribute mobile phones, because a lot of the standards that are used for mobile phones haven't changed at all. So a mobile phone which has been working 18 months ago is very likely to also operate in the next 2 or 3 years. So there's immediate reuse opportunity, but you can also refurbish that. And these are different economic revalorization options, which you can also cost. If you stay at the bottom of that chart, if you take a recycling approach, typically in a mobile phone costing about $40 US, you have about $3 worth of raw material in it, sort of typically silver, gold, etc. It takes a tremendous amount of cost to take them out, and you make a laser thin margin. A lot of the specialized corporates on recycling still sort of make a good business out of it. If you would actually change that process and be more efficient in it by collecting more phones, by potentially tagging data on it and understanding the material composition better, you could dramatically improve that. So there is a good case of being efficient in the way that you revalorize products. Now, there is also discussion around effectiveness. So instead of grinding this down to its material content, you could also resell the perfectly functional mobile phone, and you would get about $30, $23 worth of revenues. Obviously, the cost of organizing the reverse chain is substantially higher, so about $17. But the profit that you make is also quite more substantial. So there's typically a factor up to 10 between recycling materials and the reuse of materials possible. And that sort of informs a lot of the drive to not go back to recycling, but to really go for reuse. At that time, we looked at remanufacturing, and obviously it was not possible to take mobile phones apart and maintain the product integrity of some components. But for instance, cameras, the sending and receiving device, they are pretty mature parts of the mobile phone. So it's not necessary to actually replace them. So by modularizing the mobile phone, you could also create a positive business case out of this. So when you think about how to harvest and create these opportunities, there are typically 4 questions that one needs to ask. So one is sort of, what does it do to product design? And in the mobile phone case, there's a project which goes back some time. There was an initiative in the internet to say, why don't we create a modularized phone? It was called Phone Blocks. It was bought off by Motorola, then by Google. And Google is now selling these type of products, for instance, in Latin America. and it's a fully modularized phone where you can sort of choose depending on your requirements, a larger battery for longer life. You can have a larger processor if you need some little computer, etc. And it's being an open source industrial collaboration where different providers of components have agreed upon interfaces which are well defined. So that mobile phone doesn't become obsolete, it only becomes obsolete in its components. So you dramatically reduce the amount of components that you need to exchange, and it's still commercially very attractive because you still have the competition and you can upgrade it and stay in the latest fashion. So that's why design is such a very, very critical element in creating the technical prerequisites for later revalorization. Then new business models are very important. So if you're in a consumer market and you sell products, typically that goes out to many, many customers, and it's virtually impossible for you to bring this back at scale by going through all of the drawers of your hundreds of thousands of customers. So what Vodafone did in the UK is they offered a deal where you get the latest technology mobile phone against a contract. You basically get this as a lease, but you need to return the mobile phone after 1 year, and you get the latest version of the next generation phone. What Vodafone does, it takes that product, ships it off to Asia, where basically there's a short delay in market adoption of new technology, given sort of different pricing points, and they sell the product a second time. So you get 2 usage cycles out of the same product. But having these business models is very crucial because otherwise companies don't get the economic benefit of bringing products back, and they're very much afraid of otherwise cannibalizing then their virgin sales, which is a big prohibitor of the circular economy gaining traction. You need to be able to bring these products back in quality, well defined, and in the US you have Eco ATM. It's a machine where you plug in your mobile phone, it measures it, there's somebody on the other side checking that it's not a stolen device, etc. But they actually know exactly the quality of the phone at point of transaction and can quote you the right price. So it de-risks completely the interaction of bringing the product back, and then they have very much a similar chart as I just showed you previously on saying what is the best option for valorizing that specific type of phone that they just collected. And there's a big opportunity to start collaboration and put standards in place that actually takes away a lot of the need for obsolescence. And in Europe, you have a standardized USB charging requirement, and today you already get phones without a charger at all because it is assumed that you already have a USB charging device or cable only at home. So it's always very important to think through these different design parameters to harvest the opportunity of a circular economy, and a lot of them actually then go very, very quickly deep into very relevant legal questions around sort of IP protection, liability, etc. So if that can be done with a mobile phone, it can also be done with other durable goods, and that pointed out an opportunity in excess of 630 billion euros in net savings on materials alone without secondary impacts. And that triggered quite a bit of interest from governments to think through how can we actually make that type of value creation work in real life. And that triggers quite a bit sort of the EU package to get also the additional labor effect and maintain products in Europe, as sort of Europe is very much as a manufacturing place exposed to importing raw materials. If you do that now at a global scale, you don't look only at durable goods, but you also look at fast-moving consumer goods. You get another 700 billion globally, for instance, via reprocessing clothing, by avoiding food waste, etc. So overall, in total, it's $1 trillion worth in annual net material savings, and that's a substantial saving, which is at economic scale quite relevant. And then there is a second type of benefit, as this requires a lot of the corporates to move away from manufacturing or product business to product service business. The share of services will increase, and then you enter in the tertiary sector, which typically has a lot of positive multiplier effect. It does require more labor per activity, it triggers more innovation, and it requires typically less capital. So in itself, these are all indicators that say that you can hope for accelerated growth when transitioning that. And that's very much the economic argument why this makes sense also from an economic point of view. So it can decouple, it can be economically attractive for individual business, and it would have very likely a very positive effect at economic level. And that's why sort of that concept of circular economy has gained a lot of traction. Now the question is always at that point in time, if that is so fantastic, and we have seen already that many other concepts have been around for much longer than the concept of circular economy, why is it not really sort of taking off very quickly? And there's a very few set of inhibitors that make it a challenge for corporates to implement this. The first one is you have an incentive alignment issue. So what you see up there is another sort of German beer bottle program. Typically you buy beer in glass bottles which you can return. A beer bottle can be used up to 40 times, so it's a perfectly circular system, but it's losing ground in sales because the shops that actually sell the beer bottles, they rather have more shelf space to put much more product through. So you have an uneven distribution of incentives that needs to be put in place. The same thing happens if you start selling secondary vehicles, and your sales staff, which is incentivized to sell new vehicles, will get less remuneration on a lower number of sales. Geographic dispersion is critical. A lot of the manufacturing doesn't take place in the US or Europe these days. It's Southeast Asia, China. And there's very little possibility to bring back products for many sort of legal implications on shipping products at end of use which are deemed waste back to the point of origin for remanufacturing or reprocessing. Material complexity is another big inhibitor. So the young gentleman that you see there is picking out straws, not only because straws you theoretically could reuse as is, but it's a defined quality, so you can recycle that. But the proliferation of different materials has made it very hard to find measures of scale to harvest that opportunity. So these are the typical inhibitors, but there is a lot of opportunities for corporates to go after that. And what large corporates do, the OEMs, they typically travel back through the reverse value chain. You have corporates like Li and Fang, which are specialized in setting up supply chains within little time, sort of typically days or weeks. They find you the perfect suppliers, etc. And here on this thing of a power drill, sort of this is already quite a simple device, but you see the complexity in the upstream bill of materials. There's nobody looking these days at the reverse side, and that's what we call the dark side of the moon. Sort of, is it best to actually reuse the power drill as is? Is it best to actually only change certain components, or is it best to go through the material content? And that intelligence is currently completely lacking. And there are many corporates that actually have the know-how to do that and find out pockets of value for deciding how to revalorize products at end of use by traveling back the bill of material tree. Then there are companies that have a footprint and have a very material intensive product. And the carpet we already mentioned is such a product. So where you find that material costs can easily go up to 50–60%, including supply chain costs for processing. And what Desso did, very famous example, on the design side, they applied cradle to cradle, a sort of a separable cover, fully recyclable yarn. They have a business model in place where you can lease the product so they don't lose ownership, and they have established a take-back scheme and invest in their own recycling facility. And that was taken private and has achieved tremendous revenue and also EBIT growth, and was recently sold to one of the other large carpet companies. And if you ask Jeff Kronendijk, the CEO, so he claimed that there was a multiple of over 8. So it's very attractive value creation tool for companies that have a big footprint in materials. So it's what we call the CE transformers. There are other business models like enablers, where you fill a gap that is essential for actually keeping products in loop. And iFixit is a wonderful example. In the US, it's one of the fastest growing companies. And the idea is basically to crowdsource repair manuals for a lot of different devices. And they sell them the spare parts, and they sell basically the tools that you need. And that has enabled a lot of other small and medium enterprises to actually go into the market like, you break it, I fix it, and offering service on top of that. So we call them the CE enabler. And there are many, many people that offers. We heard about this marketplace of the products. And there are lots of entrepreneurs these days out there that take advantage by filling capability gaps in the reverse cycle. So that's another very attractive way to do that. Again, sort of here, a lot of legal questions if you scale up such a business around IP, etc., liability issues, and their force. Now that's also a completely different perspective. If you play this forward and ask sort of right now, we're very much talking about company-specific closed-loop solutions. But if you would think the economy at a completely different scale, and there's a lot of regional programs taking place, sort of CO2 valorization, a lot of the good work that has been done in the industrial ecology, which is being sort of done, masterminded in Asia a lot. And you think about CO2 food revalorization, there's a lot of potential you can harvest. You could think about setting up material standards, and that was sort of what the colleagues from McKinsey sort of published last on the plastics roadmap, sort of to agree on certain standards, tagging of products, to actually increase feedstock of quantity. And you then sort of extrapolate this with the technological revolution that's taking place, that you actually take a lot of products and you virtualize them, or you take bio-based 3D printing and take zero marginal cost approach. You could very much localize a lot of the remanufacturing and the refurbishment opportunities right there. So you can win as a corporate by transforming your business. You can provide enabling facilities, and you can sort of collaborate with others to form new ways of local economic clusters that produce, again, value. And that very much concludes the short introduction that I prepared. And while sort of there are many skepticism out there, if you really put your mind to the circular economy, it's not trivial at all, because it's a cross-functional approach, it's a cross-value chain approach, and it's sort of not the, as it was called earlier, the cylinders of excellence approach that has provided a lot of efficiency gain. It's very much a question of reorganizing the chain laterally, but nothing is impossible, specifically if it's inevitable. So thank you for your attention.
Let's hear it for that presentation. Thank you very much. Dr. Zils, do you have time to take a few questions from the audience?
Yes.
Great. Anybody in the room? I'd like to just, and this might, I don't know, I'd like to take a shot at one. Do you see economic advantage for developed countries that have already started this transition away from manufacturing to a service economy? I mean, it seems like that's a logical guess for me to take, but is there data to support that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think there is an advantage if you're sitting close to the point of consumption, because the closer you do this at home, the better is on the transport and the supply chain costs. And yes, if you actually have sort of the technological means and you put also sort of automation towards the remanufacturing and recycling industry, that also drives down costs. But sort of I lived 5 years in Africa, and people are starting to complain that there is not enough flow of used materials back to the manufacturing origins, and therefore they consider that as a competitive advantage of the North, keeping materials in place. And if you believe around that there is residual value in the stock that we have already around us, then we are sort of very rich as we sit on a lot of material bases. Yeah? And what is done in China, for instance, they do quite a program on urban mining, where they go through old landfills and recuperate more copper, for instance, out of landfills than they can actually produce from mines. So there's absolutely a competitive advantage by using the technology strengths and the capability to invest in these type of opportunities, and it's also a good way to repatriate a lot of employment, which talks to the question of the social opportunity that resides in the circular economy as well.
Thank you very much. Questions in the room? I saw one in the back.
My question is Germany doing anything to apply this philosophy to retrofitting existing buildings for energy efficiency?
Yes, sort of on the sort of Germany is a special case. We are very much locked into our recycling industry on the consumer goods, but there is actually a national law which increases the energy saving standards of new builds, and that is also applicable for existing infrastructure. So if you refurbish a house, you need to adhere to the modern structures, and they're going to prohibit a number of materials used in the future. So specifically around sort of an energy sourcing, that's very much both an incentives scheme around solar power generation, but also a lot on insulation, which is by far the biggest driver. Sort of a lot of, for instance, public buildings are getting their windows replaced because that's typically one of the largest points of leakage. And you think about sort of the total material pool that we have in a Western economy, it's about 45 to 50% sits in the built environment. Yeah, it's very slow turning, but it's a very durable asset, so that you need to upgrade it as well to modern standards from an energy point of view.
Yes, hello. Given those constraints that you talked about, linear lock-ins, geographical dispersion, and so forth, how difficult a road is this ahead? How many decades will it take to even build the basic infrastructure for the circular economy?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I think there will be pockets where it actually goes tremendously fast. So if you look at, for instance, at the automotive sector, classical sort of product business, but they grow at 3 percentage points a year globally. The service business on top grows currently at 30% per annum. Yeah? So if you extrapolate that with electric mobility, etc., and intensification of use with car sharing schemes, etc., that can go very, very quickly. And again, sort of large corporates like BMW, they're collaborating with one of the leading car rental firms. They can very quickly apply that to the economic advantage. And a lot of people have recognized that they have a massive exposure against attackers from the sharing economy, because they can take basically existing staff and put this into their digitized offering, and leaving sort of the incumbent with the market, which is continuously declining in the product sales. So they can go very, very fast. I think in terms of the infrastructure required, I would differentiate between the software and the hardware. I think a lot of the hardware that you would need for moving stuff around is already there. I think we have excellent transportation mechanism. The transportation also very fossil fuel intensive, is very quickly also decoupling in terms of renewable energy. We have sort of heard the example of the empty truck. There's a lot of horizontal collaboration now, programs in Europe to make co-loading possible. I think on the physical infrastructure, we're actually quite well established. I think where we're not well established is on the soft infrastructure, sort of how do you actually organize pre-competitive collaboration? How do you start sharing know-how broadly in an open source fashion that allows people to provide the right designs without violating IP laws? How do you create trade agreements between regions to transport stuff back and forth? I think that is a much, much harder multi-party approach. That's why I think also the conference that you're running today in Washington is so important, because establishing that soft infrastructure, I think, is for me the biggest challenge.
Thank you. More questions in the room? Anything from our online audience? Okay, last shot. Dr. Zils, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd join me in one more round of applause for our keynote today.